I look at interfaith relations through history, I always see it as a strength or a positive feature of various empires throughout history. So you can go back to very long time ago. So when Ashoka was the emperor of India, he was a Buddhist, and he was really interested in having various religions in his empire. He never really kind of imposed one religion on others. When you look at Spain during the Middle Ages, Christians, Jews, and Muslims all lived together, and that part of Europe was like the hotbed of innovation and scientific advancement that was really a model for everywhere else. You look at Egypt during the Fatimid dynasty, there was Christians, Jews, and Muslims of various different backgrounds all working together in the same way. So I always see interfaith diversity as a strength for various empires and kind of different powers. I see America as kind of as a next in line to that tradition of interfaith diversity. It's one of the most diverse countries in the history of the world. We really have a great kind of history of learning from each other's traditions.
Who do I really look up to? I look to my peers, actually. I look to what young people are doing now. I look to Chris Stedman. I look to people who are bringing people together, and I think that's one of the great things about the interfaith movement is that we're not telling people what to do. We're not telling people how to think. We're just convening. We're bringing people together. And I think that's the big mark, and it takes courage to do that, to be an interfaith leader.
Malcolm X, or Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, is a very important faith leader for me as well as an interfaith leader. And most people will kind of raise an eyebrow at that. What do you mean Malcolm X is an interfaith leader? You know, he was a black nationalist. And this is true. He was a black nationalist. But he was also the type of person who I very much respect, and that is somebody who is able to grow spiritually and emotionally throughout his or her life, somebody who's able to absorb new information and then apply that in their life. And this is not really a skill that a lot of people have. And I want to really kind of highlight a time in Malcolm X's life when he was essentially in exile from the Nation of Islam and decided to reconnect with God by going on the pilgrimage in Mecca. And while he was there, as he wrote to his wife in a letter, very famously, slept under the same tent as white Muslims with blue eyes and blonde hair, and shared the same cup. But it lifted the veil from his eyes of, white supremacy is a problem, but it is not inherent to all white people, right? And it's a system that could be dismantled, and it had to be dismantled by working with everybody. And that, this is a man who is 38, 39 years old, who came to that point after he had a religious experience to really kind of see, well, we really are equal in the sight of God. And if people have that lens and they see me as equal to them, even though I'm a black man, well, then we can certainly work with that.
There are three individuals, both from American history as well as Chicago history, that stand out for me. And those are the work of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Jane Addams. And I think that, they were operating back in the day when interfaith movement wasn't necessarily, what people talked about. But I think that their work in civil rights and social justice issues resonated with not just the communities that they were working in, but cross-culturally. And we can see that now. They're always quoted. They're always referenced in any sort of speech relating to civil rights or social justice work.
For me, my interfaith role models, I think, really reflects or mirrors my own experience and my own cultural identity. Growing up, as is often the case with children of immigrants, you face kind of this cultural identity crisis as to, am I really Indian? Am I really American? Oftentimes you act and think and speak one way at school, and you have to kind of change that when you go home. And so one of the first people that I really felt proud of to, I could represent, this person represents who I am, was Gandhi. And because that's someone that, most Americans know about, you learn about in school. And I think I was maybe even in middle school, or maybe it was high school, but I remember reading his autobiography, which is My Experiments with the Truth, and remember reading how he would have prayer meetings leading up to for the freedom struggle. And in the prayer meetings, they would read from the Quran and the Bible and the Gita. And I thought that was amazing because here's someone that lived, many years, many decades before me, and I felt like he had successfully bridged this kind of cultural crisis, identity crisis that I had faced. Later on, growing up, I think in high school, my social studies teacher, Mr. Kermit Eby, who sponsored Spectrum, which was a multicultural organization, showed me that to not be afraid to, one, express who you are, and two, to want to learn about other peoples. He was a white, male Christian. And you would think that he checks all the boxes for being privileged, but he was so humble about what he knew and his willingness to engage in conversations and to be kind of an outspoken advocate for people to have conversations that you generally wouldn't have in a public school, especially in the classroom.
In terms of examples for interfaith leaders, I think there's a lot of examples. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Rosa Parks. I think there's a lot that just come to mind automatically. For me, though, it really is my mom. And it's her taking me to the art museums. It's her inviting into our home a Muslim man who was here away from his family and didn't have a place to stay. And in inviting him in, she offered him a place to do his prayers every day. She didn't force our beliefs on him or tell him that that wasn't good enough. She let him worship in the way. And he, in return, then respected and came to our family prayers and read scriptures with us and shared with us the teachings of the Quran that he felt like were the same. And we shared in this commonality, and yet we had this diversity that was woven into our lives and created a dimension to our own understandings. A leader that I always look to is Benjamin Franklin. When you read about the creation of the Constitution and the United States, he really was a unifying person. He was someone that was the hub of a wheel for all of these different ideas, and he knew how to compromise in a way that would make forward change happen.
I've had a number of interfaith role models, and one who stands out in my mind is the Reverend Dr. Paul Sorrentino. He was director of religious life at Amherst College, and I had gotten to know him by way of the Multi-Faith Council that he and I worked together to build. And I was, with great animation, serving carrots or vegetables of some kind to a line of hungry students. And Paul called me over, and he asked me a question that remains incredibly transformational. Have you ever thought of becoming a rabbi? So there I was, a Jewish student, loving being part of Jewish community, asked by the director of religious life, who is an evangelical pastor, if I might consider becoming a rabbi. And Paul remains with me a guide, a mentor, someone who teaches me so much.
Personally, I would say my maternal grandfather. He was a humanitarian at heart. He was very kind, very wise person. The day before he passed away, he was on basically his deathbed in the ICU, and he still managed to text me good luck all the way from India on my SATs. That was the kind of heart that he had. And I think living his legacy was sort of why I'm very thankful to be a part of this movement, because it continues to remind me that my heart comes from people in my own family who've lived this through and through. I like to follow as much as possible the principles of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh faith. A lot of people still don't know him, actually. I would say 90% of people in the United States still don't know who he is. And I think once they study the Sikh faith and realize who he is as a person who tried to bring people from different faith traditions together, establish this idea of truthful living, selfless service, and eternal devotion to God, is fundamental, I think, in this process of seeing that we have a lot more in common than we assume, and that our differences can be appreciated and respected.
An unsung hero of the interreligious movement in the United States is someone who is engaging with different religious communities in a more quiet way, more behind the scenes, and not just in the United States, but on the international stage. And that person is Dr. Georgette Bennett, who is a philanthropist and activist based in New York City. She is actually one of the founders of the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And she's a Jewish woman who was born in Europe and came to the United States in large part because of the Holocaust. And she has, over the course of her lifetime, created opportunities and facilitated connections between religious communities that might not otherwise engage with one another. And I think her ethic is that we all must pick up our shovel, or if I don't have a shovel, I have a rake. And if I don't have a rake, I have, the resources to buy a rake. And say, we all can do our part in providing for refugees. So taking something that is a crisis in our generation, that's the worst crisis for refugees that we've seen since World War II, and saying we all have a duty, and it's part of our tradition. And she, as a Jewish woman, says very clearly, and I think movingly, about why she, as a Jew, as an American Jew, sees this as some of her life's work.
I'm reminded immediately of Martin Luther King, who took to the streets in a big way as a very, very young person, and who faced police brutality and multiple arrests in order to stand up for what he believes in. That's something that I hope I could do someday. There are faith heroes who have taken the fight right to the barricade. Is inspiring and also a bit scary, because it makes me think, could I do that? Could I live out my own religious values in that way? But at the same time, I think of people like Thomas Merton, a American monk, a very American monk, who embodied the Catholic ethos of introspection and of learning about oneself through self-thought. He also maintained active relationships with people of other faiths, not just non-Catholic Christians, but Buddhists and Hindus and people who follow Shinto. He was a interfaith outreach person before that was a popular thing. And his example of building a friendship across religious lines has guided me in my work as well.
One of the people that I really look up to within the interfaith movement is Krista Tippett. And I think she's not traditionally a part of interfaith work, but what she does on her radio show and podcast On Being with Krista Tippett is have these very intimate conversations about faith and belief and values. But not only in a way that emphasizes this inner transformation that we have, but also the outer transformation that is possible from engaging with dialogue, and especially engaging in dialogue across difference. In media and in journalism, we don't have many models of what it means to authentically engage across difference. And Krista Tippett is one of those people who is doing it week after week, and I think helping people shape the questions that we're able to ask one another in ways that are respectful and engaging and get to the core of what we mean when we talk about identity and what we talk about meaning and purpose.